Okay, great. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to talk here today. My name's Laura Newman. And since January of this year, I have been the postdoctoral research associate on the Addressing Health project with these lovely people, some of whom I think are in the audience today. And to kind of give a very brief overview of our project, our main focus looks at occupational health in the Victorian and Edwardian Post Office, but we kind of have a much broader objective to look at how we as historians discuss occupational health, particularly concepts relating to morbidity and mortality. So I came to this project as a verified die-in-the-wall postal history nerd, having undertaken work myself on occupational health in the post office as part of my PhD, where I focus particularly on worker responses to infectious disease. But as a project, we're not just interested in infectious diseases, we're interested in the whole gamut of kind of health and disease experiences in the post office. But obviously today I'm talking a bit about infectious disease. And what I want to talk about today is not only kind of historical precedents regarding health, postal work and pandemics. Particularly I'm quite interested actually thinking as a historian of medicine is, should I be offering these parallels anyway? Are they instructive? Are they useful? Are they accurate? So that's something I'd be interested in discussing with you guys. But what I really want to think about as well is the ways in which the kind of current experience of coronavirus and living through this pandemic should inform our project work, which really lies at the intersection of the history of medicine, work and transport, and what we need to really recognise moving forward. And I kind of want to think today about mobilities, which is something I've used a lot when thinking about the post office, and I know my project team does as well. And what I think is unique about the post office is the historical contemporary intersection of different kinds of mobilities, which is really institutionally unique. And here I'm thinking about the circulation and movement of letters, parcels, humans, and pathogens. And thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of mobility infrastructures like the post office in a COVID-19 world. And I'm going to draw back here to Patrick Joyce's work on the post office, which I'm not sure people are familiar with, where he talks a lot about his kind of ideological underpinnings as a kind of almost self-regulating network of material and immaterial exchange. And I think the post office continues in theory to function as a handmaiden of the liberal state, but its dependency upon fallible working technologies, environments and humans is something that is experienced throughout its history and something that continues to this day. And here again, to kind of call back to another work, I'm thinking here of Robert Peckham's work in the third plague pandemic in Hong Kong, where he really does a lot to emphasize how the pathways of contagion and the pathways of commerce are often one and the same. And so what's really interesting to me is how mobility is at the heart of the post office's institutional project, but it's also in many ways its biggest vulnerability. And I've got some nice illustrations for you here, including the sorting office, a very beleaguered postman with a parcel post, and an old cartoon about tuberculosis, which I love because it really kind of shows, how like germs were increasingly thought of as mobile things, as things that moved with humans and transmission was dependent upon human behaviours, including working behaviours. But when we think about postal governance, I'm also interested in thinking about what mobility meant and does mean for postal workers themselves. So what my previous work into this area showed is that the working experiences of the post office helped to foster new kinds of epidemiological imaginaries that stress circulation as a key theme in understanding the spread of disease germs in the workplace. And I think the perils of mobility have been made really evident once again today during the time of COVID-19. The Communication Workers Union, which is the main trade union for Royal Mail employees, has expressed fears that postmen and women, but I'm going to use the term posties here because it's much more nice and inclusive. They've expressed fears that posties and other kinds of postal workers could be potentially operating as super spreaders. And that is lifted from this article by Dave Ward, who's the secretary of the CWU. And what's really interesting here is, like in the history of medicine, we think about typhoid Mary. So we think, okay, how is the post office going to figure in new histories of the asymptomatic carrier? And this is coming at a time when the labour of postal workers, particularly posties, is probably more visible and evident than it's been in a very long time. In late April, we had National Postal Workers Day, where we saw little kind of messages like these and kind of displays of biscuits and treats left out for posties by people. And again, this belongs obviously to a much broader history of that we're kind of witnessing and the making at the moment about the visibility of essential labour and what constitutes essential labour, and kind of this public expressions of thankfulness. And really, again, it really does, like, the postie is like existing in the public imagination and is there in the public imagination, I think, in a way that hasn't probably been for quite a long time. But then when we kind of move down and we think about the perils of mobility for the individual worker, we have a number of great testimonies coming forward from posties today about this. So this is a piece of artwork from Marion Johnston, who's a postie from Ayrshire in Scotland. This is from a really wonderful project called the Workers' Stories Project at Consol Media, which is overseen partly by Ewan Gibbs at the University of Glasgow. And what I really love about this image as a kind of artifact of work is it really shows how Marion is, firstly it shows the stresses she's under, this kind of quantity of thoughts just pressing down on her, kind of making her work so much more complicated. But I'm really interested in the ways in which these little thought bubbles she has all around here show how she's rethinking or reconceptualizing these once common working behaviours she had, particularly these kind of bodily encounters. So I'm thinking here, so there's a speech bubble on the right where she says, "Are they offended I didn't hand them the parcel?" And "No, don't open the door yet." And it's just things like these which really demonstrate the kind of the thought processes of individual workers and the kind of dangers that come with moving mobile bodies during the pandemic. But these are essential bodies, nonetheless. This is essential labour. However, it'd be wrong to portray the embodied experience of postal work, either historically or today, as endlessly or ceaselessly mobile. As much as I love posties, they're not the only type of workers who work in the post office. And really, when we consider the post office as an arm of the information state, to kind of go back to Patrick Joyce, it's historically depended much upon sedentary and indoors white-collar work, which was often characterised for its very immobility and confinement. And it was within these indoor environments, especially the Victorian workers, identified dangers through poor sanitation, the perils of physical proximity to other workers, and the depressing effects of sedentary work on the constitution. And during the 1889 influenza outbreak, where some of the first clusters of cases came from post office environments such as St Martin's le Grand in London, but also the Cardiff post office as well. During this outbreak, telegraphists who are particularly kind of prone to outbreaks of influenza blamed these cramped working conditions in which they spent long hours in close contact with each other for the disease. And we can see here an illustration of one of the telegraphist rooms at the GPO. And if we move up to the right, more recently in April, post office workers in Chatham in Kent staged their own walkout over complaints that their own much more modern working building was so cramped that they could not observe social distancing guidelines and were also given inadequate PPE. And this isn't the only walkout that's been staged by postal workers, there's been a few others. And this is more of a side note and kind of an interesting thing to think about, but it's interesting to note here that many Victorian and Edwardian postal buildings are still operational. Many of them are pubs now, as I've learned, but some of them are still working buildings. And this is the one in Creek Road in South London, near where I live, and I pass quite regularly. And I think the presence of these working environments attests the importance not only of understanding histories of contagious disease in the post office, but also getting us as historians to think more about spatially, so to think more about built environment and historical and modern disease control strategies and kind of what that means. Right, and as a kind of conclusion to this kind of assemblage of thoughts I've been having as a historian of the post office in a time of corona, so as a political project, the post office has for long served to strengthen the foundations of the liberal state, but entangled within it are these number of these fallible technological and human actors, both of whom are vulnerable to disease pathogens and other kind of biological contaminants. And the post office has for long battled with the kind of moral quandaries that come with the tension between this kind of institutional objective and the lived realities of work. And this shows no signs of abating if we think about all the activity that we're seeing with the CWU. But I think there are new questions that we have to consider, ones that don't necessarily apply to the Victorian and Edwardian experiences of pandemics. And I say this with the caveat of I haven't been to the archives in a while, so I can't say this for sure. But I'm thinking more and more today about how our increasing dependence upon logistics workers and transport workers in delivering key consumables like medicines and food. But then the flip side of that is considering what constitutes a vital purchase nowadays. So I'd be interested to think of this idea of if being an ethical consumer is now going to increasingly bring into its remit ways of thinking about how can we protect the health of posties. And here, again, something that's quite specific to this day and age is the proliferation of other kinds of logistics and companies like Hermes for delivering parcels. And these are obviously workers with with basically virtually no employment rights when we compare them to Royal Mail workers. And so really I'm interested in this idea of the ethical consumer and how that's going to evolve to incorporate ideas of other people's occupational health, or if it will. And because of this, recent slogans such as "Stay home, protect the NHS, save lives" are really interesting historical artifacts. To me, as a historian of the post office, but also as a historian of occupational health, because it's deceptive, because immobility is like such a key public health strategy, and particularly in the time of COVID-19, we've all been experiencing this sense of confinement and stillness. But slogans such as those are obviously partly deceptive, because this very capacity to be immobile is dependent so much upon these semi-invisible networks of mobility, of logistics workers such as the post office. So yeah, that's my kind of assemblage of thoughts. Just to say thank you so much and to plug our project. Please visit our website, it's beautiful. We have great blogs, including the one this is based on, but a lot of other stuff as well. Please email us if you want to write for us, or just tell us we're great, or just if you have a question about the post office. And also follow us on Twitter, and I have a Twitter as well, but our project Twitter is where it's at. So thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing you guys' thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm really glad I asked you to go first. That was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah, to time and mastering the technology as well, really well. Oh, look at this. We've got a sea of little hand clapping emojis.
Yeah, I know. Thank you so much, everyone. That's really sweet. I really appreciate it.
But we're going to move straight on to our next paper.
Okay.
This is Viv Newman. So Viv, if you could make yourself known. Hello.
Hi.
It's nice. Again, I feel much more comfortable when I can see people. Let me just make you a co-host. Are you going to be sharing any slides? Or just...
I am, yes. Hopefully. I'm not very techno-savvy.
Right, that should now work. What you'll need to do is just hover over the main screen.
Yep.
And then in the middle, there's a share screen button.
Yep, got that.
And then you should be able to select the file that you want to share.
Right.
Perfect. So, Viv, I'm going to disappear again. Again, we're about 24 minutes past. So you've got about 10 minutes. If it goes massively over, I'll start shouting. But
right.
I'm going to and let you do your bit. And again,
okay, then.
If you want to introduce yourself, please do.
Right. Hi, I'm Viv Newman, and I'm a First World War historian specialising in women and women's poetry of the Great War. But today I'm going to actually be talking about nursing, and more particularly when adapting was the name of the game. Faced with acute shortages of medical equipment, Nurse Yvonne Fitzroy concluded, "What we haven't got, we invent, and what we can't invent, we do without." Written in October 1916, this could easily refer to 21st century responses to COVID-19. Medical services and suppliers have had to rethink and rapidly adapt to meet the pandemic's challenges. World War I nursing personnel also thought outside the box in order to cope with the challenges they faced and provide the wounded with the best possible care. Then, as now, adapting was truly the name of the game. By late February 2020, it was clear that some hospitals in France and Italy were not coping with the rising numbers of critically ill patients. Some would need evacuating rapidly to alternative facilities. Trains were adapted so that within a matter of days they began to resemble mobile hospital wards. Similarly, in World War I, casualties needed to be transported as quickly as possible. In September 1914, The trains used were not fit for purpose. One nurse wrote, "You boarded a cattle truck armed with a tray of dressings and a pail. The men were lying on straw, had been in trains for several days. Most had only had their wounds dressed once, and many were gangrenous, more ghastly than anything I have ever seen or smelt." Fortunately, things did soon improve. Trains were converted to ambulance trains, and a nurse, Kate Luard, considered these cutting edge, apart from one drawback. They had no corridors, so, ignoring official prohibitions, nurses clambered from coach to coach while in motion by way of the footboard. Don't forget, they were also wearing ankle-length skirts. They also carried a load on their backs, as aseptic as possible under the conditions, which contained dressings, medicaments, and in addition, during the night, when going from one coach to another, the sisters had to carry hurricane lamps suspended from their arms. Kate was proud of her expertise at clawing along the footboards. Mirroring so many of today's nurses' disregard for their own personal safety, nurses simply accepted that they could not do otherwise, knowing that the men on each coach might perhaps be dying for want of attention. If trains were used to move patients quickly during the Great War, the lives of some of the most severely wounded depended on being jolted as little as possible. As northern France is riddled with waterways, barges were pressed into service. However, it is almost miraculous that many wounded survived the embarkation process. They were lowered by ropes and pulleys, often worked by the barge's cook, through the open top of the barge to the wards below. Despite these apparent shortcomings, the popular press were enthusiastic about this mode of transport, which is the most ideal means of conveying wounded, as although it may be slow, wounded men are in no hurry. It was lucky they were in no hurry. Bad weather could delay the journeys by as much as 42 hours. Shortages of essential materials are also nothing new. One barge nurse pleaded for the abrasive cleaner Vim. Another longed for a special pudding recipe book, as on her barge at least, the cook was either unimaginative or unskilled when it came to puddings. He could only produce sago, or stewed fruit. Difficulties of life on board extended beyond needing Vim, recipes, or even nursing men who were more frequently more dead than alive. Some barges were barely fit for purpose. Our barge became more and more leaky until we simply paddled from bed to bed and then had to lie up for repairs. In winter, slippery decks meant some nurses taking an unexpected dip in the freezing canal, and many took to crawling along the decks on a rather undignified all fours. In addition to their nursing duties, when patients were offloaded, cleaning, with or without Vim, was undertaken, an essential task as soldiers were evacuated to the barge straight from the battlefield. They were often filthy and lice-ridden, and when they had been gassed, poor barge ventilation meant that other patients and staff would suffer a mild gas attack, which could lead to breathing problems and worse. Being bitten by lice could lead nurses to develop typhus and trench fever. Sadly, catching infections from patients has always been a hazard facing the nursing profession. PPE was also in short supply. Funny how that acronym now trips off our tongues. The need for face masks and ways of making these is not simply a product of this pandemic. Masks exercised the minds of two women working with the Belgian army in April 1915. Woken by the sound of firing, they write, soon everyone began to cough and choke. One woman wrote, out of the queer green haze that hung over everything came an unending stream of soldiers, stumbling, staggering, gasping, all a livid green colour. It was the very first gas attack. A high-ranking British officer asked the women for details of the Belgian-issued respirators, whether we considered them effective at any distance from gas. They were too embarrassed to explain that they had fashioned their own relatively efficient gas masks out of Mr. Southall's hygienic towels for ladies, in themselves an invention only dating back to the early 1890s. We are now all familiar with the many amazing staff working within the NHS who come from around the world. This too is mirrored in the Great War. As soon as war broke out, Australian nurses rushed overseas. Amongst them was an Elsie Tranter. Her war service included casualty clearing stations, which were very close to the front line. Nursing was often accompanied by the sounds of firing, which, thankfully, is one thing our COVID nurses have not had to deal with. Elsie wrote, "We can hear the guns quite plainly, such a noisy night. Shells were whistling and screaming. Then there was a horrific explosion, and the wounded began pouring in." Elsie admitted to being quite afraid, but this was helped by a good Australian mateship. Of course, being with others made us feel safer. You can't face these things alone, but with a pal beside you, you feel strong to face danger. It's worth pointing out that alone in your hut meant being the only nurse caring for perhaps 50 or 100 very severely wounded men, almost every one unable to save himself if the casualty clearing station was shelled. One thing that nurses did have to deal with, exactly the same as our nurses today, is hair. How many of us actually haven't bewailed the closure of hairdressers? Whilst today's nurses can at least wash their hair, if not get it cut, this was not the case in 1918. And so I thought I would close with one of my favourite stories, which again concerns Elsie Tranter. Desperate to get her long and indeed filthy hair washed, and having been given a few precious hours off duty, she walked into what remained of the nearby town of Camier. To her dismay, she writes, "All the hairdressers seem to have left town. However, I saw a little shop with all manner of toilet requisites in the window, and Madame, who looked as if she couldn't say no, standing at the door. I made my request in the best French I could muster. Soon there was another problem, drying the hair. Madame became greatly distressed. Then she was struck with a brilliant idea. Opening the oven door and placing a cushion on the floor in front of it, she bade me sit down and put my head in the oven. A novel way, no doubt, but it answered the purpose. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that Elsie survived both her hairdressing and nursing experiences, returning to Australia in 1919. Between 1914 and 1919, approximately 25,000 professional nurses cared for the occupants of the 637,746 hospital beds at home and at sea in all theatres of war. Approximately 1,500 professional nurses from Great Britain and her dominions and 500 volunteer nursing and ancillary staff lost their lives as a direct result of their war service. According to The Guardian, by the 22nd of May 2020, some 200 medical and care home staff had died of coronavirus in Great Britain. Their dedication, their ingenuity, and of course their personal sacrifices are summed up in the simple words a wounded soldier spoke to naval nurse Anna Cameron in 1915. "Thank God we have the nurses." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viv. And again, a really, really fascinating insight, and really nice to see actually some of the themes that came out from your blog, but explored in very different ways. And the emphasis here, again, very much on the individual stories, the personal stories, and what that means sort of in aggregate. Again, I think there's going to be a lot to talk about with the questions here. But without further ado, we're going to move on to Michael Reeve. So Viv, it's goodbye for now.
Bye.
And Michael, if I can find you somewhere, where's Mike?
Hi Henry, I'm here.
He's here, brilliant. And again, nice to see you. So we're going to stick. You're the sort of forming the last part of our sort of analogies part. You also wrote a blog which was looking at these face masks and sort of exploring that. Although I'm sure are you connecting this into some other work that you've been doing at the moment?
Well, actually, I found through writing the blog, which was mostly taken from kind of excerpts. Well, the kind of raw information, the raw research was from my PhD thesis that I completed last summer. I found through writing the blog and through thinking about, you know, these historical parallels and different aspects of this this kind of small blog that I wrote for SHS. I found that there's probably it's got legs, as it were, and I think it's an area of work that I think I can develop more.
Fantastic.
So it's been really helpful.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad to hear so, and I've just made you a co-host. I think if Viv can hear this, if you could take down your PowerPoint, because I think that's stopped me from making Mike a co-host. But I think if you could take that down, hopefully Mike is now able to share a screen if he can. Yes, fantastic. Okay, so we are then at 2:35. Again, you've got about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have the questions at about 1:45. So I'm going to disappear, and we can't wait to hear what you've got to say.
Okay, thanks, Henry. I'll try to keep to time as much as I can. So yeah, as I was saying, this is kind of a developing area of work for me, and it's actually really helpfully through the process of writing the blog and doing little bits of extra research for the paper that I'm going to deliver today. I've found that it's it could be a really interesting area of work for me to go into in the future. So any comments you can make at the end or at any point would be helpful, and I hope it does raise some interesting questions that chime well with other papers today. And a note on myself, I recently was awarded a PhD in history from the University of Hull, my illustrious hometown, and I now work at least partly at Bishop Grosseteste University in Lincoln as a lecturer. Anyway, I'll crack on. So the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the fore questions of public safety and community resilience. Many towns and cities across the UK have seen a flourishing of mutual aid activity, including the production of personal protective equipment, or PPE, for NHS staff and other key workers. This usually comprises face masks, visors and gowns. Voluntary groups, individuals and small businesses have switched to a kind of war footing in order to produce and deliver PPE for hospitals and care homes running low on supplies. For me, as a historian of wartime resilience, most often focused on the First World War, this voluntary action has reminded me of the efforts made during the First World War to provide supplies and comforts that were in short supply or perceived to help soldiers at the front. Most notably, and quite famously, this included warm knitted socks, bandages, food, board games, gramophone records, and probably more than anything else, at least numerically and culturally to some extent, cigarettes. Funds and voluntary groups were started from the very outset of the war. These were run from people's homes, from pubs and clubs, churches and workplaces. They're most often referred to as comforts funds, and they took a panoply of different forms. And here's an example of some of the smoking-related voluntary scheme fundraising drives. And this work was viewed by many as essential to the war effort for many aspects of what we might see as frivolous today, like the provision of cigarettes. They ranked alongside warm clothing in their importance. Indeed, smoking was synonymous in the period with psychological coping and endurance, all the more important in the ever-shifting conditions of life in the trenches. And I'm sure, even if you've not noticed it before, whenever you see a painting or a photograph of soldiers from that war, you'll always see somebody in the frame with a cigarette or a pipe. So if you've not noticed it before, keep a lookout for it. And it's not too much of a stretch to make parallels with the voluntary action that's arisen during the ongoing coronavirus crisis. Before clothing retailers and fashion brands cottoned on to the demand for face masks, despite the UK government not deeming them universally necessary as yet, a lack of supply led to community efforts to produce PPE visors and masks, often with ordinary people taking to their sewing machines at home. The news has been replete with stories of the efforts of local communities during the last 3 months. But as if acknowledging that such work cannot completely make up for shortfalls in essential PPE, there have also been calls for the production of DIY, do-it-yourself face masks for individual use. So guides and instructions have sprung up in a variety of places, online and in newspapers, with information on how to make your own protective masks at home. You've got some examples on the slide. This can be placed within the context of the Johnson administration's relatively laissez-faire approach to anti-COVID public health and safety measures, where the onus has been largely placed on individuals and communities to change behaviour to suppress the virus. in lieu of an overarching infrastructure for the dissemination of masks, strict lockdowns, and increased levels of semi-militarised policing. And I'm not endorsing draconian measures per se, but we have seen measures such as this in countries around the world. And what we have seen, whatever flavour the measures have taken, a more timely and thoroughgoing response does tend to work. For me, this immediately brought to mind efforts to combat the threat of attacks upon civilians during the First World War. Where there was a combination of far-reaching state regulations, including legal instruments, and calls for changes in public behaviour. Of particular significance here was the threat of invasion and bombardment that was very real during the war, including the possibility of poison gas attacks upon civilians. The Defence of the Realm Act and an associated suite of regulations was enacted shortly after the outbreak of war in 1914. And this allowed the government to rule by decree, including requisitioning land, factories and buildings for military purposes. It also had far-reaching impacts on the everyday lives of civilians on the home front, as we now tend to refer to that space. And it had a strong remit related to public safety. So there were regulations on lighting and noise, curfews were introduced, and some coastal towns became militarised spaces replete with barbed wire roadblocks and trench systems, usually dug into beaches and cliff sides, and cliff tops, I should say. Many civilians were prosecuted and fined for breaking rules, especially related to lighting. There was a form of blackout, which is obviously more synonymous with the Second World War, where shops and homes had to extinguish or obscure light at night as a guard against enemy bombardment. Though parallels between war and the COVID crisis are often clunky and inappropriate, as Henry's written in a couple of blogs for SHS and for History and Policy. In this talk, the parallels are in terms of the government approach to public information and the circulation of ideas related to community and resilience in popular culture and public discourse more broadly. The threat posed by COVID-19 is indeed more pernicious in some ways than the threat of a falling incendiary or gas bomb. Though bombardment's arrival may be unpredictable, fueling anxiety, the virus is not visible to the naked eye. It arrived without being announced by an early warning alarm, and it circulates freely among people. Saying that, its effects on everyday life are broadly similar, though again, the virus has the potential to more severely affect the economy and have longer-term knock-on effects than any war we've seen. But a little more on the context of the threat against civilians during the First World War, so all of this makes a bit more sense. So where protective masks come in is in the direct relation to what was happening in the trenches of the Western Front in early 1915. When chlorine gas was first used by German troops at Ypres. And indeed Britain followed them in introducing this in September 1915. And this is the second Battle of Ypres where it was first used in April and May 1915. The protection devised for soldiers was improvised and rudimentary, but the supply of masks was immediately construed as a national effort. As Susan Grayzell has written, a War Office appeal at the end of April 1915 was published in local and national newspapers, calling for the whole country to be set to work. As the Hull Daily Mail's version put it, the remedy for this latest development of German infamy is the respirator. 500,000 are needed at once. Our men must be protected, and it should be possible to supply 500,000 respirators in a few days. The whole country should be set to work. Schoolgirls could help, and their services should be utilised. The chief difficulty arose in connection with the most improved pattern, but this trouble will not prove an effective obstacle. Respirators began to flow in yesterday afternoon, and by this evening many thousands will have been completed. The new frightfulness of the enemy will thus be met and counteracted, but its wickedness will remain. I'm sure much of the sentiment of that text can be applied, to what's going on today. Some of the earliest evocations of the possibility of gas attacks on the home front occurred shortly after the use of chlorine gas at Ypres. In June 1915, the National Fire Brigade Union published a pamphlet recommending a, quote, very simple form of respirator for use by their members. This was to be a protection against, quote, asphyxiating bombs, taking the form of a cotton pad soaked in hydrosulfate of soda and glycerin, and these were neutralizing agents. A list of ingredients and instructions was appended in the pamphlet, meaning that local fire brigades could follow the instructions to produce masks for their men. The mask design was more or less a carbon copy of the most common form of respirator at the front that you've seen pictured so far, until they were replaced by the now familiar small box respirators in early 1917. And the picture you can see on the board of those instructions isn't from that pamphlet, but it's an approximation. I couldn't actually reach a lot of my research files because they're locked away in an office that I can't get into. But anyway, that's an approximation for illustration there. There was a very clear process of domestication from the outset of this threat. Even before gas attack was countenanced as a possibility at home, women were hard at work sewing makeshift masks to send to the front, and businesses were developing and experimenting with different kinds of masks made of various materials. It wasn't long before there were discussions in the popular press related to civilian use of masks in the face of this invisible, unpredictable, looming threat. There were pictorial guides, such as the one pictured here, on conduct within the home during Zeppelin air raids. Here, the use of respirator masks is centre stage. And fashion columns discussed the use of this technology in city streets, and I just highlighted part of it here that I thought was quite funny as well. So in this column, in the sketch, the writer highlights that I'll read it. So if anyone does fear the Zeppelin poison bomb bugaboo, so this kind of bogeyman, respirators are quite inexpensive and easily carried. I have met odours in the streets of our dearly beloved and peaceful metropolis, which would make the possession of a respirator precious. So why not respirators? So people in the city are pretty smelly, so why don't we just use respirators anyway? Some other examples, including an advertisement for a metal respirator on the right, and some various early versions of the mask, which are remarkably similar to ones that people are using today. In 1917, the box respirator was the norm for soldiers at the front. So this led to calls at home for similar supplies for what we would now call key workers. And that's an example on the screen of what the box respirator looked like, and it's probably what most people think of when they think of a gas mask, that kind of bug-eyed view with the kind of elephant's trunk at the front. The city of Hull in East Yorkshire was seriously affected by Zeppelin raids during 1915 to 18, giving the local fire brigade and voluntary police plenty of work to do in controlling fires and disposing of unexploded ordnance. The innovation of small box respirators for fighting men was seen as readily applicable to workers on the home front. In November 1917, Hull's Chief Constable George Morley wrote to the War Measures kind of czar, A.L. Dixon, of the Home Office, to ask for a supply of respirators for the city's firefighters. Dixon was not willing to fulfill his request. So this is what Dixon said. So he said, "So far, poison has not been used in aircraft attacks in this country. I suppose the use of poison is not impossible, but there seems a good deal to be said for not diverting large numbers of masks from the front, where they are so much needed, while there is no immediate occasion for their use here at home." So we can see that even vitally important war workers, like firemen, could not take precedence over soldiers at the front. A kind of wartime economy of sacrifice, where blood was the currency, placed combatants at its apex, with civilians of all kinds ranking second. Political decisions about the perceived likelihood of attack influenced the degree to which supplies for civilian workers were prioritised. Though it seems obvious that soldiers would take precedence in the context of war, it remains the case that the First World War was utterly total in scope, more than any conflict in the modern era before the Second World War, and the threat against civilians was very real. But in terms of direct provision of protective equipment, it was viewed as more expedient to encourage domesticated production, do-it-yourself masks made according to easily followed instructions. If the supply chains and materials are not there, this is at least something that can immediately be done. So the process of making a mask today, as during the First World War, can be viewed as an act of service, as well as of self-preservation. We have seen a nationwide drive to make PPE for those most exposed to the virus, a selfless act most often undertaken by volunteers, in addition to efforts by companies and fashion brands to profit from a gradually emerging cultural shift in the potential universal wearing of masks. Obviously, that's something that's developing. Making a mask at home to wear when you go shopping or take a bus can arguably provide a means for stealing resolve in the face of a threat. It suggests that something can be done to guard against it. Indeed, this has been suggested by commentators and scientists during the current pandemic. It's an application of the precautionary principle. We may not necessarily know for sure that a measure works 100%, but if it's integrated into everyday life, it can become a means for encouraging resilience. At any rate, it's better than doing nothing. In the First World War, activities as various as smoking cigarettes, knitting socks, and making simple respirators were utilised as tools in a war against enemies seen and unseen, against poison gas and psychological strain in almost equal measure. This is a lesson I think we can take from this application of historical precedent to the current ongoing crisis. The other lesson is that decisions made by government officials and planners, be they in the public eye or behind the scenes, are inherently political. They, of course, take account of rapidly changing circumstances, but they've been shown to be often framed by widespread perceptions of threat and conceptions of sacrifice. We have, unfortunately, seen a return to public discourse of a hierarchy of sacrifice, where discussions arise related to who should be prioritised in government supplies of PPE, who should or should not take precedence in the queue for respirator machines. Decisions, just to conclude, decisions can be made slowly due to a lack of preparedness or as a result of being taken by surprise. In the case of both the response to the prospect of gas attack during the First World War and now to COVID-19, domesticating and diffusing responsibility for personal and community safety throughout society can demonstrate, on the one hand, a lack of preparedness and ineffective infrastructure, and on the other, the willingness and creativity of ordinary people to improvise and experiment, and fundamentally to support each other when a crisis is at hand. The human stories, historically and as we live through them today, are the ones that provide the most important lessons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I let that run on a bit because the point about the hierarchy of sacrifice really, really interesting, and likewise the examples.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Great panel, and thanks very much for inviting me. So what we've got here for me is that my paper is set against a background of a curious time that we find ourselves in as historians. We seem to be occupying present time, positioned as live participants in the unrolling of major historical events. We are also occupying past time, reaching back for historical points of reference, comparable experiences and lessons learned, and also occupying, from some of us maybe, future time, thinking forward to the legacy that we'll leave of what we've all gone through. And I began in straight away really a set of articles, short articles for a popular free online community newspaper, the Lincolnite. And as I wrote those pieces, I found that my approach changed, but four themes developed. One was in many ways what we've seen so far and have been sharing. This is about public history reference making to the First World War and the Spanish flu waves of 1918-19. And sorry, I'm just going to. Sorry, you still with me all there? Had a problem with my slideshow, hopefully it's carrying on, but anyway. So first is public history reference making, thinking about the First World War and the Spanish flu. Secondly, was actually engaging with oral history and recalling those who recall or passed on memories of the Spanish flu and other epidemics. The third is to foster creative artistic responses to the coronavirus lockdown. That's the third, and I've been doing that with looking at regional dialect poetry. And then fourth and finally, sustaining networks and communities and so forth. And so really this paper is 1 and 4, if you like. It's about that public history message making, but also sustaining networks. And actually I produced this lecture, this talk, if you like, for the British Association for Local History, and they just put it up on their website this morning, part of their 10 minutes talks there. They're encouraging. And so I've been looking at the Spanish flu epidemic through provincial newspapers, almost as if how did local communities travel through the experience that we were also traveling through in present time. And I was looking, of course, at Lincoln, and we can see here that clearly press reports show how much the impact changed over time. I mean, it's very, very different from different communities, economies and societies. But they also say something about the wake of the pandemic. So anyway, I've been looking at the Lincolnshire Echo, British Newspaper Archive, helping me out here. And provincial newspapers performed an essential function, passing on global national news, sampling the newsworthy from around the UK regions, different centres, looking at what was felt to be of political, economic, social and cultural interest and significance. Language is always quite diverse. You've got the objective and the partial, and then you've got the informing, the entertaining, the critiquing, and the sensationalising in the same way that we see the media today. So hopefully you'll find yourself on my second slide, which is about the chronology of the 1918. This is one of my early Lincolnite posts that actually things were unrolling in a scarily familiar way. So we have the remarkable rumours of the pandemic breaking out amongst German troops and that it might hamper their war effort. We've then got through the newspapers, then the 3 waves, midsummer, then autumn, and then the following late winter, early spring of 1919. And really in that summer outbreak, the nation had to come to terms with the fact that we could get influenza in the warmer months. And also it could strike people more than twice in any one year. So in the local press, by June, the epidemic was getting closer to home. The Grimsby district has been invaded by the influenza germ. And by July in Lincoln, we had calls to end the summer term of schools early. When we get to the second wave, the autumn wave, we've got, again, notices going up about school closure. We've got eventually by mid-November, I know this has caused problems, but schools being reopened to allow for the armistice to be celebrated. A month later, mid-December, we got local health officials confirming that new cases had actually start to fall. But we then get this third wave, and as late as February 1919, local health officials publicising again appeals for community volunteers. Through the newspapers, we get different responses. So I'm going to jump my slide a bit. So yeah, local newspapers, posters, word of mouth is where we get the official guidance. Medical officers of health gave guidance to the local authorities, and in October 1918, I published actually in the Lincolnite. So much that you see here being published was what we found mirrored in the common sense measures that we were being asked to take, but also the official directives. Local authorities facing similar decisions, if not closing places of entertainment, asking for ventilating rather than disinfecting. We've also got public meetings in November 1918 being closed in the lead up to the general election. We've got, again, the unexpected appeals. We've been confronted, and we've been confronted by these. Bovril saying to customers, to stop buying its product, actually running out of bottle supplies and wanting to get it to the needy. We've also got milk becoming short, and again getting it to the young and to invalids. Medically, you know, we had reports about concerns about an antidote being discovered, that the disease is very virulent, and that eventually at least the virus would be identified. And then at the same time, in less regulated times, we've got drug manufacturers claiming, you know, what their antidotes, what their products could achieve. Here we've got unfailing remedy for the disastrous scourge of influenza now ravaging through the world. We've got equally a selection of reports into 1919 saying, in a way, how the medical profession, medical services, social welfare would adjust in the same way that we've been thinking about how would we cope. And again, similar concerns about central control with resourcing and so forth. And here we've got the Lincoln Rural Workers Insurance Society welcoming the establishment of a new Ministry of Health, and saying that clearly the greater centralisation would help with communication at the least. Also, we got the Lincoln branch of the St John's Ambulance seeing this as actually an opportunity, launching an important extension of effort to workplaces, offices and other establishments. And then this is again so often as things that make you think about today, how deeply it has been felt that there was something more that one can do for one's dear ones lying ill. So again, cutting through to the present. And then the Lincolnshire Nursing Association lamenting concerns over confusion about the funding and supply of nurses, with the responsibilities being split between local authorities and voluntary bodies. And again, this difficulty about whether health at that time was a general service or a charitable function. And at the same time, a new ministry emerging, and what would that bring? And launching a nurse in every village campaign to try and really cope with and put in place for the future what had just been gone through. And then here we are with just some references. You know, I've done some pieces for the Social History Society and history, and there's some history and policy pieces, and also history workshop online. And it was really absolutely that I found myself traveling through past and present, absolutely trying to connect quite actively my historical research with popular opinion. And it stemmed really with those Lincolnite articles. They weren't really academic pieces aimed at an academic. It was my first interest and concern, if you like, for the people amongst which I work and live with, and how they were trying to cope with the circumstances they found themselves in. So there we are. I hope that's okay. Sorry about the bit of a jumble up on slides.
That's absolutely fine. I said, I'm impressed that everybody is managing to do this, because it is a very strange format, but lots to get our teeth into there, and particularly this idea about inhabiting both present times as historians, past times, but also thinking forwards. I know something that a lot of us have been sort of considering in recent moments. For now then, Andrew, if I could ask you just to mute and to hide yourself again. Fantastic. What I would like to move to next then, I think if we go to Helen Frisby. Helen, are you available? Here we go.
Hello, Henry, I'm here.
Fantastic. It's nice to, well, to hear you. I still can't quite see you. Is the video
Hold on 1 second. I'm so sorry. I just popped to let the cat out.
Oh, don't worry. One of people have been saying, actually, one of the benefits about these sort of virtual conferences, obviously it's strange not being in person, but we are able to find cats and toddlers without anybody seeing it. So that's a good thing. Right, I've just made you a co-host.
Lovely,
so
thank you.
We've got some slides. You will be able to share them. Again, we're about 20 past. I'm conscious we've got 3 more talks to fit in. So if we keep these to 10 minutes, we will still have 15, 20 minutes for discussion at the end. But
Okay.
Helen, over to you, and you might want to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Henry. Yes, before we start, and on the subject of pets and kids, I do need to let you know there is a possibility you might hear a noisy cat in the background until I can get someone to sort her out. So I apologise in advance if that happens. I actually don't have any slides. What I do have is a series of thoughts on the so-called COVID funeral, as it's rapidly becoming known amongst those of us in the world of interdisciplinary death studies, and how this might fit into perhaps a longer narrative of historic funeral customs. As someone who's been studying the history of funeral customs for 20 years now, I too have come to suffer from radical doubts about the applicability of direct parallels then and now. Rather, I would think of old customs in new clothes. The idea that there are some very sort of deep and fundamental sort of human things when it comes to facing our own mortality and those of our loved ones, which manifest again and again in the guises of their own times, and this was very much a backbone of my book, which was published last year. I wrote a chapter on death in the future, not knowing what was just around the corner. So perhaps that chapter will have to be rewritten. What I did argue was that while these material manifestations of the social and emotional and spiritual process of dying, they may or may not shift over time, what does remain is that kind of golden thread that through the times, and the book covers a very long sweep of time from the Norman conquest right through to the present day, and as I said, some speculations on the future. And really at the core of the book is the idea that funerals have two fundamental related purposes. They get the deceased where they need to go, and they get the bereaved where they need to be. So funerals are about reconfiguring those social and emotional relationships between the dying person and the still living. And a pandemic of infectious disease obviously presents certain challenges to that process. But over the next few minutes, I'll suggest that this is also part of a longer and deeper trajectory of how people, and I'm quite sort of UK and specifically England focused in this presentation, have over time sought to achieve those purposes. Again, that idea of old customs and new clothes. Now, one challenge which has sort of quickly emerged in relation to sort of dying with COVID is that people have been unable to be present at the sort of deathbed, and there was a media outcry, I'm sure you remember, around the beginning of April when 13-year-old Ismail Mohammed Abdul Wahab died of COVID, and much of that was made that this poor child died alone. And this idea that a good death is accompanied by relatives and other supporters is really very sort of fundamental in representations of deathbeds throughout history. This goes right back to the Anglo-Saxon period. It goes through the Middle Ages and early modern period, where we see the flowering of the Ars Moriendi, a genre of manuals on how to die well, epitomised by Jeremy Taylor's 17th century rule and exercises of holy dying. And of course, then the deathbed scene, surrounded by those relatives and friends and other supporters, becomes a staple of Victorian deathbeds in art and literature, and remains very much a kind of underpinning assumption into the present day. So it's really, really deeply rooted, and that's perhaps something that Matthew Hancock, the health secretary, maybe was sort of implicit when he turned around and instructed hospitals to try and find ways for people to be present in some ways, because this is really, really important to people's ideas of what it is to die well. And people have been really creative in the solutions they sort of come up, whether that's sort of attending deathbeds but wearing PPE, whether it's being vicariously present through a window or screen, whether it's people, there have been heartbreaking stories of people sitting outside hospitals or the house in a car while a death was taking place inside, of people going to quite considerable lengths to sort of get phones and iPads into hospitals so they in some way can be with the person during their last moments. And that notion of sort of vicarious presence really continues through to the sort of actual funeral itself, which I'll talk about in a moment. But another very practical problem that the epidemics sort of a challenge to establish notions of ways of dying is the inability to view and touch the body. And this is sort of the tension between the sort of private public nature of the customs around viewing the dead, again, is something that's really evident throughout history. Up to the 19th century, it was customary that all and sundry would visit a bereaved household, would touch the body, would participate in refreshments. There were all sorts of superstitions around the consequences of not touching the body, such as that the deceased would always haunt you. Interestingly, though, it seemed that these sort of viewing and visiting customs must have been quite burdensome to people. The financial and emotional strain of having all and sundry descending on you when come and judge your house, when you're having the worst time possible. So it's not surprising really that when the Chapel of Rest came to the UK in the 1930s, that absolutely mushroomed in popularity because it was a way of controlling access to the deceased. So again, you know, these are not new issues, but they've really been exacerbated, these issues of power and control and access to the dead. They've been exacerbated by current events, and certainly as more becomes understood about how the virus is transmitted, one is hearing from funeral directors that that, you know, sort of viewing is gradually being allowed again, albeit with barriers and PPE, but efforts are being made to facilitate that as much as possible. Another very practical challenge in arranging funerals at the moment is around sourcing the sort of customary accoutrement of a funeral. And again, when he's hearing tales from funeral directors of, you know, people being very creative about how they source the elements of a good send-off. There was one particularly touching story I heard from a funeral director colleague about sort of neighbours were unable to buy flowers, so instead they appealed to the neighbours via Facebook for donations and were absolutely inundated. This is where I have to say I find it quite amusing to deal with my sociologist colleagues who think this is all terribly new and exciting. Of course, as historians, we have that longer perspective, and we know that kind of more community-based approach to funerals was actually the norm historically, and the idea of a professional funeral director has only been around for 300 years or so. Yeah, so attendance at funerals has been very problematic in recent weeks and months. Firstly, sort of travel restrictions, but also very restricted numbers at funerals. And this question of in and exclusion to funerals and the sort of use of funeral rituals to articulate and manipulate social hierarchy is another, again, very long-standing historical theme. And as I discuss in the blog, they've had different approaches to this at different times. In the Middle Ages, all and sundry were welcome to sort of make prayers for the soul. But from the early modern period, we do see increasing attempts by families to control attendance at funerals through an invitation system and a bidding etiquette that continued into the Victorian period. And again, people are really incredibly creative about how they constitute some kind of vicarious attendance at and involvement with funeral services. virtual attendance via webcam is one, although it has to be said, issues with that, and that have not always been reported in the press. Also the parallel funeral, where people who can't attend the funeral do something that invokes the deceased at the same time, such as listening to their favourite music or eating their favourite food. The secondary funeral post-pandemic, we're seeing a lot of, if you look at the obituary columns at the moment, we're seeing a lot of, due to the current circumstances, we will be holding a memorial after the event. Again, that's not a new thing, but it seems to have been accelerated by the current pandemic. There's also, of course, the phenomenon of direct cremation, where there's no funeral at all. And this has been growing in popularity for about the last 10 years, actually. So, yeah, again, not new. And to me, it's as a funeral historian, it is very reminiscent of the debate around cremation, the first institution of cremation in the 19th century, when there were concerns that it would sort of it would rob people of a chance to sort of say a proper goodbye and give the deceased a good send off in the sort of shared understanding of that. Hopefully what I said, summarised very quickly, suggests that the pandemic isn't prompting so much, we say, radical new funeral customs, as it's another chapter in a continual process of accretion and deletion, which is that sort of longer sweep of custom and tradition. And I think the place of the COVID funeral within that sort of longer sweep remains to be seen, actually. I think as historians, we're especially well placed to know that things often look very different when you're in the middle of them. Will this be a historical blip, or will it be part of a an exacerbation of certain longer term trends that we were seeing before? I think whatever happens, we can certainly say that the sort of customs that we're seeing now, these old customs and new clothes, are testament to the creativity and resilience of people, you know, in the face of our own mortality in these particular trying circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Absolutely fascinating. Do you want to hold up the book once again so that we get a proper plug of that? There we go. So this is Traditions of Death and Burial, and again, Helen wrote a fantastic blog for the exchange, of which this talk is based on, and a nice bit more on the book in there as well. Right, but I'd like to move to Rebecca Ball before then. Rebecca, are you available?
I am, yes, hi.
Nice to meet you. We've not met before. I don't think we've had correspondence, but I believe you're a PhD student at the University of Wolverhampton.
I am, yes.
And in some ways, you're the odd one out here, because you're the one person that's not written a blog for the exchange. So this is all new, yeah, and all very exciting. So Rebecca, whenever you're ready, I've made you a co-host. If you've got some, share them, but the floor is all yours.
All right, thank you. I haven't got any slides, so it'll just be a close-up of my face for the duration. So hello everyone. Normally I start my talks by saying thank you for coming along today, but I suppose it's thank you for logging on and listening to my presentation today. So the idea for this talk was partly inspired by my PhD research, which focuses on continuation and change in the everyday lives of 50 working class individuals between the years 1900 and 1945. These individuals were all born around the turn of the 20th century and submitted their written life stories to the Burnett Archive of Working Class Autobiographies held at Brunel University. Although I did not get a chance to cover the topic of health in my actual thesis, I did look at death and grief. There was definitely scope to do so. And when I saw the call for papers for this online conference, I kind of began thinking really actually about the parallels and differences in our current experiences of an infectious disease with those of these 50 individuals from about 100 years ago. So I hope you don't mind me kind of using this time to unpack some of these topics. And again, it's just kind of some of my thoughts. So as of Friday, the 19th of June, the total number of deaths attributed to COVID-19 in UK was 42,461. And so the most obvious kind of parallel with the experiences of individuals at the start of the 1900s is the sudden resurgence of a high mortality rate caused by infectious disease. So just over 100 years ago, the average life expectancy was 46 for men and 50 for women. And as F.B. Smith notes, the high mortality rate and short average lifespan was caused by infectious disease, poor nutrition, and heavy labour. In fact, of my sample of 50 autobiographies, 6 of these individuals lost a father when they were a child due to an infectious disease in the pre-1914 period. Influenza, consumption, enteric fever, and rheumatic fever, one of those. Indeed, so common was death caused by an infectious disease that more of these 50 individuals lost an immediate family member to disease in the pre-war period than they did during the First World War. However, as science and medicine progressed alongside the discovery of cures such as penicillin and an improvement in the general public health, death from infectious disease has become increasingly less common. Today, our life expectancy is much longer, and it is afflictions such as cancer or heart disease that are more likely to cause our mortality. Yet this pandemic has taken us almost full circle back to the experiences of those in the early 20th century. And so I think a lot of the fear comes out of our lack of control over the situation, and of course the lack of vaccine to treat the virus. Such concerns are not unique to us. William Abington was born in Kimbolton in 1903, and he suffered from a myriad of infectious diseases as a child, including whooping cough, measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and jaundice. And when reflecting on his case of diphtheria, he recalled his amazement that his doctor was able to bring a scarcely breathing, puny specimen of humanity back from the edge of extinction. He did well to achieve this. At the time, there were no children's clinics, no national health schemes, and children's illnesses were scarcely understood. Although medicine has progressed substantially across the last 100 years, and these particular illnesses don't have treatment, I think we can see a similar sort of concern over our current lack of knowledge about how to treat this particular strain of coronavirus. And nearly every day, there does seem to be conflicting information about the viability of a vaccine and the length of immunity after contracting the virus. This in turn has led to some very dubious attempts by individuals to keep COVID-19 at bay by using unrecommended cures, including sitting in the sun to get extra vitamin D, taking anti-malaria drugs, and of course, the rather controversial interview with Donald Trump that resulted in a few individuals consuming disinfectant. Yet relying on self-administered medication without proof that it actually cures a particular infection is not exclusive to this pandemic. Born in Rochdale in 1907, Ernest Martin recalled that he had caught a case of influenza during the 1918 flu pandemic. In an attempt to cure his illness and prevent the spread of the infection to his family, they were all dosed with Fenning's fever cure. My mother swore by it, and it is indeed a good remedy. Now, I have to disagree with Ernest. It was not a good remedy. It was in fact a peppermint flavoured solution equivalent to 2% nitric acid. Fenning claimed that diphtheria was cured with 3 doses, scarlet fever with 4, cholera with 5, and influenza with 6. It was also interestingly measured out in wine glass measures. For children, it was recommended that they take around half a wine glass full. Although there does not appear to be any reports that individuals died from actually taking Fenning's fever cure, there no doubt were equally dubious cures that were also peddled to a public, and much like our own, desperate not to get ill. Moreover, whilst the government has indeed gone further than any before in terms of a nationwide attempt to prevent the spread of infectious disease, the response to this pandemic is not that dissimilar to previous governmental responses to outbreaks of infectious disease. During the 2009 H1N1 flu outbreak, several schools were closed to slow down the spread. Likewise, in 1918, several schools were also closed during the flu pandemic. And it's also recalled that there were a lot of deaths and they closed the schools for a time. Indeed, self-isolation, quarantine, and encouraging good personal hygiene were also recommended during the 1918 flu pandemic. Furthermore, self-isolation at home was frequently used at the start of the 20th century to treat infectious disease. Remaining at home to allow for convalescence and to prevent the spread of an infection was often necessary. As already noted, there were very few cures, and the cost of medical treatment often prevented many families from seeking out medical treatment anyway. Mrs. V. Austin, born in 1910 in Slough, recalled that she had caught a bad case of scarlet fever as a child, and noted that it was common for infectious diseases to be treated by a mother rather than in hospital by a doctor. She was isolated in her bedroom for 8 weeks and recalled that only mother was allowed in, and when she did, she would cover her hair and put on a disinfected overall. On the inside of the door hung a sheet, also disinfected, and when I had a bath, disinfectant was also added. The only other person that came to see me was the doctor, who kept an eye on my mother. When I was finally pronounced free of infection, the mattress, etc., was taken away and treated in case any germs still lingered. Likewise, W. Wesley, born in 1909 in Devon, recalled that she also became ill with scarlet fever when she was 5, and her parents decided, rather than have me sent to the hospital, I was quarantined in my bedroom with a sheet soaked in disinfectant fastened across the door. A disinfected sheet, however, was not necessarily going to stop the spread of an infectious disease amongst households that tended to be overpopulated and crowded. It's therefore unsurprising that several of these autobiographers noted that their family members moved out of the family home in order to prevent them getting sick. Mrs. Austen's sister stayed with her friend, and W. Wesley also recalled that her father moved next door in order to keep working and that she would wave to him from the bedroom window. Although our situation has changed since the 1900s, this is still the general pattern of behaviour that is expected from us. Unless you are the worst affected by the virus, you are encouraged to remain at home, and if infected, your family is encouraged to stay away from you as much as physically possible. Of course, not every individual is able to fight off COVID-19 in their own home, and some of the most harrowing stories to come out of the current pandemic are those of individuals who have been taken away from their home, whose family could not go in the ambulance, and who are not able to visit their loved ones, some of whom were potentially in the last hours of their life. Yet sadly, such experiences are not unique to this infectious disease. Harry Dorrell was born in London in 1903. He recalled that his brother had caught scarlet fever, and upon presenting with similar symptoms, he was taken for a ride in the ambulance to the isolation hospital, where it was agreed I had not scarlet fever, but where I picked up diphtheria. I was kept in strict isolation for 5 months in a windowed cubicle, through which I could see, but could not speak to, my fellow child patients. No visitors were allowed. The only visitors who called to see their children were the parents of children on the point of death. The two figures, mother and father, hooded and gowned against infection, they had last seen their child carried off sick in an ambulance. Now they were last seeing their child. So in conclusion, there are many parallels that I think can be drawn between our current experiences and those of individuals 100 years ago, which kind of demonstrates that history is rarely linear, rather it appears quite circular, and that very few experiences are entirely unique to us. However, of course, there are some notable differences. This level of lockdown is unprecedented, and even if the next government guidelines suggest that we all cover our door with a disinfected sheet, at least we would have Netflix to entertain us. Thank you.
Fun way to end. Thank you very much. Brilliant. I say I'm sorry that we're having to rush on from this so much, but what we'll do is we'll move on to our final speaker, and then we'll get some questions in at the end. So a nice round of applause there for you as well, Rebecca. So it's my pleasure to say that Kieran Fitzpatrick, you're going to be finishing proceedings today. Again, another of the authors of one of the blogs for the Exchange, and I think based on the conversations we've had so far, I'm hoping that this will return to some of the issues that have been raised about the importance of sort of folk memory and also the extent to which we are both inhabiting a present, past and future space. So Kieran, I will make you have you got slides to share?
No, I haven't got slides, Henry. It's just
in that case, that's absolutely fine. It's over to you, and sort of 10 minutes starting from now.
Lovely. Thank you, Henry, and thanks everyone for tuning in to this wonderful experiment in sort of 21st century history conferencing. Just to give you all a bit of context on who I am. I'm Dr. Kieran Fitzpatrick. I'm currently the National University of Ireland's postdoctoral research fellow in the humanities, and I was asked a couple of months back to write for the Exchange community blog, and I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes or so giving you some background on that blog post, and I suppose it's a little bit different to the other wonderful papers that have come before me, in that it treads a line between my identity as a professional historian, but also who I am as a son to somebody with a disability. So my blog post was titled "How My Grandmother Died: Expertise and Folk Knowledge at a Time of Pandemic." And the context for my writing the post was, of course, induced by events. In mid-March, the Irish higher education system was shut down on account of the threat posed by COVID-19. Consequently, I travelled the short distance to my parents' home in County Clare, Ireland, and I'm still here as Irish universities remain locked down, and I suspect will be for some months yet. I've not lived at home with my parents for such an extended period of time for the best part of a decade. And this, coupled with the reason why I was at home in the first place, has, I think, made me more attentive to how I relate to them as a son and the boundaries that that role shares with my being a professional historian of medicine and healthcare. For between COVID-19's outbreak and last living here for any extended period of time, I've been socialised into the historical profession as a social historian of medicine. I completed my DPhil at St John's College, Oxford in 2017 under the supervision of Mark Harrison at the Wellcome Unit for the history of medicine there. And I think this construction of a professional identity, premised as the field is in the social history of medicine, on creating and understanding the history of ordinary people, quote unquote, and everyday life as they pertain to medicine and healthcare, has perhaps felt most relevant and evocative to me in these past few months, as I found myself listening more attentively to how my parents during lockdown speak about themselves and their histories. This is particularly true in the case of my father, who when I was younger didn't hold forth very much about his own history. This was in part because he'd had such a fractured early life. His mother, Johanna, the woman who dies of tuberculosis in the blog post, was sick for much of his early life and was dead by the time he was 10. Between then and the age he left for England at age 17, he experienced little formal education, lived in a small house in rural County Wexford, Ireland, with no running water, electricity or central heating, alongside 4 siblings and his father, a fisherman and agricultural labourer, who by all accounts made an exceptional attempt at raising his children single-handedly. When one's present is as disrupted and unknowable, premised on subsisting in the here and now, there's little time left for ruminating on the past. In addition, he has since 1996 had to cope with his own bodily traumas. He was a concrete delivery driver in London, where we lived, and one day the innards of a building under construction fell on top of him and his lorry. The crane operator was a trainee and had attached the wrong weight and length of chain to the wrong piece of girder. The whole lot subsequently fell from the crane and buried Dad under his lorry. After a year of numerous operations to reconstruct his face, he went back to work, but a few years later, his feet arbitrarily began to drag and his legs grew increasingly heavy. He had to be carried off by his friends from rounds of his beloved pastime, golf, and lifted, exhausted, into chairs whilst completing small building projects at home. On being examined by a neurologist, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Whether MS was caused by the physical trauma of the accident or whether he was party to a particularly cruel twist of fate is unclear. The MS as proceed of trauma school of thought has in recent years been challenged on the basis of epidemiological surveys that suggest there's no causative link between experiences of physical trauma and later onset of MS. Either way, Dad fully entered the realm of the sick in 2009. He could no longer lift his left foot to modulate the clutch pedal on his 3-ton lorry that he was now running at a loss. Unable to find a suitable ratio, he panicked and shot across a roundabout. Afterwards, shaken by the destruction he might have wrought, he knew this was an end. In Dad's case, one of the effects of dealing with this sort of change in his physical capabilities, which had defined his entire life to date, working as he did to construct bus shelters, train tracks and buildings, was to induce silence. I never got much of a sense, either through his not being forthcoming or perhaps me not being a good enough listener, of what his young life was like. But as the years have worn on, and as has become apparent during lockdown, he's become more liable to speak about his early life and formative years. The story of Johanna's death and how it occurred is one of the results. He spoke about it unprompted to a depth of detail that I'd never previously heard after breakfast one morning at the beginning of lockdown. I knew she died young of TB and had been intermittently sick for years, but I knew nothing of his intimate memories about the few days before she passed away, nor that, in his words, he felt, I knew me mum, but I didn't know her either, if you know what I mean. I thought this a particularly eloquent way of thinking about how we come to know our experiences of illness and disease and their borders and limitations in ways that are truly ours, rather than received in the language and the media of experts. I've been struck in the earliest stages of COVID-19 at the recurrent presence of novelty as a term used to describe the virus, which left me wondering, well, novel for who? The answer was that the disease's novelty spoke to its technical novelty within science as the latest mutation in the family of viruses we know as coronaviruses. However, I also felt that left uncritiqued, that novelty was divorcing people of the resources they had, perhaps hidden but very close at hand, for making the novel seem more knowable and consequently more manageable and less alien. This was what I referred to as folk knowledge of disease in the exchange post, which was designed to indicate just how near at hand in our recent past mass experiences of infectious diseases were. I thought that perhaps through learning a little more about the experiences of those closest to us who coped and were shaped by diseases like, for example, tuberculosis, although polio would be as applicable, we could equip ourselves with a form of knowing disease and its social impacts that lay beyond the language of scientific expertise, from which the vast majority of people certainly in the UK, Ireland, and around the world, are disenfranchised from through barriers to entry, including geography, social class, race, gender, and the admissions policies of universities. As you'll be able to read in the post, having those conversations with Dad has put us into closer contact as a father and a son, but has also made me reflect on my status as an expert of sorts too, and the system that has produced me. I think that when we're working in fields that are socially oriented and confront issues that strike at the heart of our society and communities, identity, belonging, dislocation, difference, then our pathways into the profession should reflect that broad social mission. And this perhaps explains my interest more generally in my research about professional identity in historical context, the late 19th and early 20th century, and the way that expertise plays with that formulation of expertise. Maybe I'm an anomaly in thinking this, but it surprised me that there was so much to know about my father's experiences, both of his mother's death and of his own confronting ill health and chronic disability that I haven't mentioned very much here, that went unnoticed until I was induced to spend an extended period of time in his company. We are, as a family, by no means distant. In truth, we're very close and rarely argue or fall out. And I was trained in a field that had as its focal point the social history of medicine, which of course included well-known themes such as the patient's turn, in an effort to democratize the history of medicine away from triumphant histories of medical progress. And yet, it took a mass incidence of infectious disease for me to come into closer relations with my dad, who's coping with a chronic disorder, and his emotional and historical experiences in relation to it and his mother's death. Just to say on a final point, I think that belies something about the ways in which we're trained as historians, particularly social historians, that our incentives as doctoral candidates and early career scholars are so often totally premised on publishing and teaching within the profession, that very often the social mission of our work extends that in a way that often seems like an added extra, which involves hours of unpaid labour, lack of support, and piecemeal recognition for our efforts on extending that social mission. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I've had my views on these issues conditioned through becoming a historian at an institution in Oxford that has been, and to an extent still is, a bastion of exclusivity and privilege. However, say I'm not, I think we could do with greater degrees of specialisation in order to use our status as experts in the study of the past to empower the lay public to engage with the powerful folk knowledge that exists within and around them. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kieran. An incredibly thought-provoking piece.